As I mentioned during the first video, we see a problem with Agile. The paradigm has served us as a software-intensive systems community really well, but it is starting to come to an end. And the challenge is, in my view, that there are several areas of work where Agile is not providing coverage. It's simply not part of the equation. These are things that include things like product management, systems engineering, and how we scale working in larger organizations, which would include the architecture dimension, how to work with data, how to think about organizational setup, and how to think about business. So when we start to think about the next paradigm, one of the things that I do or did was to define what I call a straw man proposal for how we can work with a next paradigm. What could be the elements of a future paradigm that is the successor of Agile? And luckily enough, I came up with something that has the acronym RADICAL. So RADICAL is, of course, an acronym. It's the first letter, R, stands for responsive. In my view, Agile in many ways is a reactive paradigm. Basically, it assumes a kind of steady state. And then when something changes, the idea is that I, in an Agile fashion, respond to that change. But it doesn't really give a clear direction. There's not a clear strategic focus of where we want to get to. And I believe that that is an inherent part of any paradigm that will focus on the topic of software-intensive systems. We need to be clear on what is the vision that we are pursuing, what is the definition of success. And then the second is, as we are pursuing our strategy, our vision, what we consider success to be, we have to be clear about triaging external forces. There will happen things will happen around us, and we cannot ignore all of them, but we can probably ignore some of them. So, and the idea is that rather than responding to everything that happens to us, we have to evaluate every input that we get and clearly think about what is it that I need to respond to, and what is it that I can actually ignore or not respond to in the same way. And of course, finally, there is the whole notion of redefining success. Companies evolve, industries that these companies operate in evolve, and what was a successful vision and a successful strategy and a successful way of working initially was obviously, or at some point in time, is not the optimal way of working anymore. And at that point, we have to start to think about how do we actually change our definition of success? How do we evolve the company? How do we focus on the next goal and target that we have? The second letter in RADICAL is the A, and the A stands for architecture. Agile in many ways is very much a process-oriented or ways of working-oriented focus. And architecture has really not been part of the Agile paradigm in any way, shape, or form. But I believe, in my experience, architecture is absolutely central for anything that we do. I mean, there is, of course, multiple aspects. I mean, one is the relation between business strategy and software architecture is well known. And for those of you that have worked with me in this context, know that I often refer to the architects as being the ones that create the real business strategy for the company, because the design decisions that you take sometimes years ahead of time make certain business strategy options really easy to pursue and other business strategy options really difficult to pursue. So this is, I believe, an important part, that we have to reason about the relationship between business strategy and architecture. The second aspect is I work a lot with software-intensive systems companies that also have mechanical and electronics parts in their system. And there the challenge becomes, how do we link the system architecture, which encompasses all the technologies needed in order to build the system, and the software architecture? How do we link those two? How do we make sure that the system architecture is not constraining the software architecture? Because often we use the software architecture to support something like DevOps, for instance. But at the same time, how do we make sure that the two are in good alignment with each other so that we have optimal outcomes? And finally, I think an important topic that we have to think about in the context of architecture is refactoring. Architectures evolve. I mean, this is one of the things that in the 90s we never thought about so much, but architectures need to evolve. So in order to evolve, the architecture needs to be refactored. And how to go through that is one of the interesting things that I think we have to get much better and systematic on, because many companies are working with this in a rather random fashion. The third letter in radical is the D, and the D stands for data-driven. And the interesting thing is, even though the companies that I work with have petabytes upon petabytes of data available to them, most of the decision making these days is still very much opinion driven. So people have opinions. If the data supports their opinion, they may use the data, but by and large, whenever there's a conflict between the opinion of individuals and the data that is available, the opinions win. So I believe that we need to fundamentally change the situation around that. The first is we have to focus on defining the outcomes that we're looking to accomplish in quantitative terms. It is very easy to, in qualitative terms, say, oh, we want to go in that direction. No, you want to put quantitative outcomes down. And this can be things like revenue, but this can also be things like the number of customers, the defect slip-through rate into the field, the cost of serving and maintaining the systems in the field. But you have to be quantitative in your outcomes, because otherwise it becomes too easy to declare success in a context where things maybe are not going so well anyway. The second aspect is experimentation. I see that many companies struggle a lot with accepting that there is a significant amount of uncertainty in their business, that simply taking a certain decision on the assumption that there will be a certain outcome does not actually mean that that outcome is also realized. So rather than basically building the whole thing, including a kitchen sink, and make it gold-plated and throw some Swarovski diamonds on top of it, instead of that, build and execute small experiments that allow us to determine in an iterative fashion if we're moving in the right direction or not. And then finally, data management. If you want to be data-driven, you have to focus on managing your data in a smart and systematic way. And that requires a much more in-depth and thought-through approach to how we manage the data that we actually want to use for decision-making. The fourth letter is the I, and it stands for integrated cross-functional alignment. What we very often see is that there are tensions between the different parts of the system, that R&D does its thing, product management does its thing, sales and general management does their thing. But what we need to be careful about is that we need to build mechanisms where we can achieve alignment across the business. And in my view, one of the best ways to achieve that is by focusing on cross-functional teams. Rather than having sales sitting over there and product management here and R&D somewhere behind me, let's get those people together. Let them operate in a cross-functional team where they together can focus on accomplishing the outcome. We all know that intra-team coordination is much more effective than inter-team communication. And if we go up to functions and departments and companies, the coordination cost only goes up. So what we need to do is we need to focus on cross-functional teams. The other thing which is important is that cross-functional teams need to be steered in different ways than what traditional teams need to be steered in. In my view, it is much better to focus on quantitative outcomes and give these teams KPIs to move towards. And the final topic that we'll be discussing around under the integrated cross-functional alignment is the architecture, link between architecture and teams. I think that that's one of the things that many people are struggling with in quite significant, to a quite significant extent. The C in radical is concerned with continuous. Why do we care so much about continuous? Because one of the key drivers and key enablers in digitalization is the adoption of DevOps, data ops, AI ops, ML ops, etc., etc. And under continuous, we focus on the arguments of why it doesn't happen in practice. One of the arguments is that customers claim, or at least people in the company claim, that the customer doesn't want DevOps or continuous deployment. And I think that that's a fallacy. It's very easy to say, oh, but the customer doesn't want it, so never mind. But what people very often fail to do is to investigate, why would a customer not want it? I mean, if I think of myself, if I'm offered improvements on a system that I use on a continuous basis, of course I want those improvements. So if the customers don't want the improvements, then there must be other reasons that make the downside risk of taking new releases higher than the value that you're actually delivering. So I think that that's an important thing to look at. The second aspect is very often companies that are stuck in traditional business models do not have ways to get paid for their continuous deployment. So we need to think about our business models to make sure that we can monetize the continuous value that we're delivering to customers. And then finally, one of the arguments that is used against working with continuous practices is systems engineering. I mean, especially people that have a background in mechanical or electronics engineering tend to think in terms of much more waterfall style ways of working, and they simply do not believe or see the value of being able to operate continuously. So we have to work on systems engineering and doing systems engineering in such a way that even if mechanics and electronics are not continuous, we are still working our ways or not disabling the software and AI part of our systems to work in a continuous fashion. The A in radical, the second A, is aligned on business goals. What we very often see is that teams in organizations fall into the local optimization trap. And what I think is very important is that we find a way in which everyone in the company is putting their energy towards maximal value creation on an end-to-end fashion. And in this context, I will focus on three things. Many companies have fallen into what I call the worthwhile many trap. So if you ask, for instance, an automotive company, what is the value of a vehicle, you get all kinds of answers, anything from fuel efficiency to driver safety to convenience to minimal total cost of ownership, etc., etc. And the result is that every team and every individual in the organization can create some kind of story on how they are adding value to one or some of those factors. Companies need to get clear on what are the vital few KPIs that we need to optimize for, and what are the things that we can ignore outside of that. Not that they're not important, they're still worthwhile, but they're not part of the vital few. Second, we need to define in some clear way how every team is connected towards a quantitative business outcome. This can be direct or indirect, but we have to find ways in which we can quantitatively track the performance of teams so that if there are challenges with how the value that individual teams are delivering, then we have a mechanism to do something about it. At least we can identify it. We don't have to rely on all the talking that people do, but instead we can actually look at what these teams are actually delivering. And then finally, in different stages of maturity, companies have a different way in which they think about business goals. Business goals tend to change over time. What we see is that incumbents have very different business goals than new entrants that are often startups and have a very different way of thinking. So how we evolve our business goals over time and change the organization with the evolution of our business goals is the final topic in the aligning on business goals. The final letter in radical is the famous L word, which of course stands for leadership. Leadership is an incredibly overloaded word with a lot of hyperbole around it. Everyone likes to talk about leaders and informal leaders and formal leaders, etc., etc. But the fact remains that leadership is critically important to align large groups of people around a common goal. And for that, there are a number of topics that I would like to discuss in future videos. The first is the topic of organizational culture. The idea is that in many companies, there's a lot of talk about culture, but in practice, the culture is basically a paper tiger. It doesn't really mean anything to any of those companies. So what we need to get clear on is what is the right culture and how do we build it? And I think that that's important because I like to think about culture as the culture of a company is what your people do when you are not in the room. So if you are not there as a leader, how do you make sure that your people are still making the right decisions? The second topic around leadership, which I think is critical, is around purpose. How do we achieve a situation in which companies are purpose-driven? I believe that, especially with the younger generations, the importance of purpose is critically important. No one just wants to work for a paycheck anymore. Everyone wants to have an idea of how what they're doing is actually adding value to society in some way, shape, or form. And I think that getting clear on purpose and then ensuring that the actions and activities within the company are actually in line with that purpose is, I believe, critically important. Yeah, it doesn't mean that the purpose-driven company doesn't mean that you can't focus on revenue and profit. Of course, we need those too, but in the same way as the CEO of Whole Foods at some point said, we can do good while doing well. And I think that that's an important thing to focus on. And then finally, on this, there is the notion of conflict. Conflict is just inherent in any situation where you bring multiple companies together. And if conflicts are not managed in a proper fashion, they can easily lead to a lot of tensions and kingdoms in the organization. You can get passive aggressive behavior, and if you're not careful, this becomes a very large backpack that the company needs to carry around for a long time. And in my view, it is up to leaders to identify and resolve conflicts, and then to work with the people that disagree with the decision that was taken, to get them to the point where they disagree and yet still commit to what needs to happen. I believe that in many organizations, the focus is that getting to a point of disagree and commit is very important for many organizations to remain effective. So to conclude, Agile, in my view, is reaching the end of its life. We need to start to think about what comes after Agile. And with this new strawman proposal of Radical, I'm trying to at least start a conversation around what could be next. And I believe that Radical still incorporates many aspects of the Agile paradigm, but it adds several new perspectives. And I think it lets go of a few things as well. And it's important to think about this, because even though you can say, oh, Jan, whether it's Radical or Agile, who really cares? But we have a paradigm through which we view the world. And it's incredibly important to pick the right paradigm, because it is, if you don't have that, it is very easy to end up with the wrong outcomes. We're going to leave it here, and we're focusing on some of the details in future videos.